will be talking about these two features. Okay, this is a feature which almost every time enabled, especially, of course, with the prevalent of, or the majority of the websites nowadays are using HTTPS. So we have 3 modules for that. At the same time, authentication is something that's always also turned on in proxy. So 2 topics, authentication and SSL today. So tomorrow we will start off with the architecture. Right, so we will discuss about the operating system architecture, how we design the operating system, and how it works, what are the different important software components, as well as the hardware components. And then we move to discuss the caching architecture. Right, so we get to understand this feature, which is a long, which has been in proxy since it was developed many years ago. And likewise, we will move to discuss some of the tools that can be used to help troubleshooting. So we have a system diagnostics. So on this module, we will focusing on built-in tools. What are those tools, and how can you make use of the tools built into proxy in order to help you with troubleshooting. And next, we have a topic regarding content policy language. So this is another way or another method for you to create policy in proxy. So during the basic, we talked about the Visual Policy Manager. All right, the Web VPN, which is a new VPN, the Java VPN, which is a legacy method in creating a proxy policy. And likewise, we talk about how the policy processing is taking place on both Java and Web VPN. So on the advanced, so sorry about the label at the top. It's just basic administration, all right? But this is advanced administration. Okay. So with that, we will be also focusing on another method or another way to create proxy policy, and that is the use of the content policy language. All right. It is important that you guys would understand this because the VPN actually is also using the CPL. Remember, there are 2 components that the VPN have. So one is the VPN CPL, and another one is the VPN XML. So, and we do know that the VPN CPL is where your rules, your layers, objects are written. So, but the CPL that we are going to talk about here is a complete separate from your VPN CPL. Okay, so this is completely separate from or independent from your VPN CPL. Though we know that the VPN CPL is used together with the VPN XML for you to have your Visual Policy Manager. Okay, so we will take a look at this a bit more details as we go along the course. And likewise, we also have a module that will be focusing on one of the diagnostic tools, and that is the policy tracing. All right, the policy tracing tool, very important debugging tool, especially for your policy. Okay, so we will spend time on this one also. We have a very detailed policy tracing troubleshooting if you are going to attend the diagnostic. But here we will likewise going to understand the different components of policy trace and how do we actually make use of this troubleshooting or debugging tool for tracing policy. Okay, and lastly, we have a module pertaining to integration. So we get to understand what are other third-party, other external devices that we can integrate the proxy. All right. So on the basic, we talk about web filtering, And over there, we discuss the intelligence service. So that is a classic example of proxy integration, where we integrate the proxy to a cloud service where we make use of it to create policy based on category, threat risk level, geolocation, which is information coming from the cloud. Okay, all right, so that will be our module. Anything outside the module that you would want to talk about or you're concerned about, we can discuss about that. No worries, just let me or ping me through chat. So and we can cover that. Same thing, part of the training, you will have your materials. So hope you already downloaded it. So 2 manuals you have, lab and student manual. Now, especially for those who just joined us, how about the lab environment? So the lab environment is you will have your own lab. So everyone will connect to a remote lab, right? There are 3 VMs on the remote lab. Let's see if I can show this real quick for those, for the benefit of, sorry. Wait a minute. We will see if I can show this to you guys. Okay, let me just use one. Okay, something similar to this. This is a VM version. Okay, so you will have 3 different VMs. Sorry, this is a Flash player version, but you will be using, especially for, never mind, let me just show the actual one, otherwise I may get you confused. Let me show the actual one that you will be expecting, otherwise you'll be confused. Okay. All right. So, okay. And let me just borrow one credential here. All right. Let me just borrow our own. Okay. So, for the benefit of those who just joined, oops. Why is that so? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So basically, this is what you should be expecting. Okay. So 2 VMs, 2 icons. Click on the Network Protection Lab there. So once click, right, wait for it to load. And you will see 3 VMs. The client, the proxy, and the server. All right, so this is the client. Okay, so you have the server, you have the proxy, and the client. So most of the time, you will be using the client. Just click on the icon, and you will launch the remote desktop. Credential is in the lab guide, so that you guys just follow through the lab guide. Okay, so that is basically what you are going to expect later on. All right. So we're good on that. Let me move over to the Okay. So if you have any question about the lab, you can ask me later once we start with it. And I'll give, for those who have not received the credential, and the link, I will provide that to you later as we start the lab exercise. Okay. All right. So let's talk about our first module. So our first module is the use of authentication realm. Okay. So first of all, why do we need to authenticate? Right? Can we create policy even without authentication? Well, the answer to that is, of course, yes, we can create policy without authentication. And if you use authentication, what is or what part of a trigger? See, when you create a policy, you have different triggers, right? You have the source trigger, you have the destination trigger, right? You have the time trigger, you have the service trigger, and then you have the action. So authentication is primarily used as a source trigger. Okay, so source means you are going to identify the individual based on its username. All right, so where do we in fact collect the username? How do the proxy know what is your username? So we will then need to integrate the proxy to your existing authentication server. All right, so in order for the proxy to find out usernames, it has to be integrated to your existing authentication architecture. And some people might ask, if I don't have it, can I still authenticate my user? Well, the proxy comes with a built-in local user database, which is empty of user by default. You can use that method, okay, but that method is using basic authentication only. Anyway, we're going to talk about a different credential type later on, but just to give you an idea. Okay, so with authentication, you can now start to create policy based on username, right? And likewise, user group. Without it, basically, you can use other triggers that we have, which could be an IP address, subnet, you know, any trigger that is a part of the source trigger, you can use them, okay? Also, with authentication, you will now have the ability to see username or user group in your web access log. So without authentication, you can only identify user based on IP address, okay? So one particular reason authentication also is enabled is that you can have a more granular policy and you can identify user based on their username instead of IP address, because most commonly IP address change. All right? So we can identify them based on on username itself, and you can create groups of user and you can put user inside that group, and then you can create policy based on group. So when you have a policy based on group, then your access log will also show group membership of the user. Okay, so how do proxy authentication work? So in a nutshell, this is how it looks like, and this is how it works. So basically, you have your proxy, and as I said, the proxy can be integrated to your authentication server. So we call this in Proxy SG as authentication realm. So we say authentication realm, basically it is the authentication server that you have already exists in your environment that we will integrate the proxy. So most commonly, because of the prevalence of Microsoft operating system in the enterprise environment, so we're looking at mostly Active Directory, okay, or domain controllers, right? So the first thing you need to do is you need to integrate the proxy to your Active Directory. So once integrated, right, you then need to create a policy to start authentication. So once the policy is in place, so the user now wishes to access the OCS. So when the user initiates connection to the OCS via proxy, the proxy will then challenge the user for its credential because you have a policy in proxy to authenticate the user. So the user will then supply the credential to the proxy. Proxy will then need to try to verify the credential against the authentication server. If the authentication server responds back with verification, then the proxy will look at the policy. If the policy, the user can access the OCS that we wanted to access, then he can access it. Content went back to the proxy. Proxy will then log the transaction together with the username of the user and send back the content to the user browser. Right, so basically that is, how the proxy would authenticate the user. Now highlighted here is that every connection must be authenticated. Now this is not always true, all right? Because it depends on how the user is connected to proxy. So we have two user or client connection method, right? Two different client connection methods that we can use to connect to proxy. One is explicit, another one is transparent. So it depends on how the client is connected to proxy, connection will be used. Anyway, we will discuss this also in one of the modules. So remember, we have 3 modules for authentication. All right? So that is basically how it looks like. So with that, let's focus on our discussion with the authentication realm. So under configuration, and you scroll down to authentication, that is where you can find different authentication realms. So basically, authentication realm is a directory to where your username and your password are stored. Right? So in a Windows environment, it is your Active Directory. Okay? Also, over your authentication servers, identified by the proxy as one of the realms, that is where you define what method you use to authenticate the user. Okay? And how do you want to control the user authentication? So when you say control, whether, because authentication is also dependent on how the user is connected to proxy, explicit or transparent. So how do you in fact configure that on how the proxy control both of them, how the proxy identifies explicit and transparent will then need to be configured separately. Okay? So that is what is needed. All right? So looking at this, you notice that there are several authentication realms. So we have IWA, this stands for Integrated Windows Authentication. We have Windows SSO, which is primarily this Active Directory. We have LDAP, and LDAP is, of course, you can use third-party LDAP servers. Active Directory also has an LDAP. Give me a second. I think someone is trying to... Okay, someone is lost again. Sorry about that. So I was saying you have LDAP, you have Novell SSO, you have Radius, so local authentication, we have that built into the system. All right, and likewise, you have your certificate, standard authentication, XML, Oracle. So all these are the different ROMs that can be used to authenticate the user. Okay, so let's take a look and focus more on the use of IWA ROM, which is, I would say, almost like 95, not 100% of the deployment is using IWA ROM, okay? Because, of course, of the prevalence of Microsoft Windows operating system. So with that, IWA ROM, this is integrated Windows authentication. It is native to Windows. It has single sign-on capability. Okay, so when you talk about authenticating to an Active Directory, there are 3 types of credentials that can be used by during the authentication process. Right, so we have basic, we have NTLM, and likewise we have also Kerberos. Right, so we will look into these 3 a bit more details later on, especially for Kerberos and NTLM. All right, now all these 3 is enabled in proxy by default. Okay, so let me just quickly show this to you. So if you go to configuration and authentication, IWA, you can see that all 3 credential types, also known as the client authentication mode, is enabled in proxy by default. Okay, so basically the proxy is going to send all 3 of them to the user. Right? So the proxy will send the list to the user. Okay, so we have these 3, basic, NTLM, and Kerberos. So when you start to enable authentication, the proxy will send the list back to the user. And the user, which is the browser of the user, will then have to select one of them, right? So we can actually try to do this. Let's go ahead and try this. Okay, so let me, as I mentioned, we need to create policy in order for us to start authentication. Now, don't mind what I'm trying to do here right now. I do not want to confuse you guys, so let me just disable this. What I really wanted to show you, okay, and just disable this one first, is that the 3 credential types. Okay, so just don't mind what I'm doing here. There is, what I just want to show you is the 3 credential types. As I said, the proxy will send all 3 of them to the user. So I just enabled authentication quickly. Okay, as I said, don't mind what I'm doing, especially the policy that I created. What I really just want to show you guys right now is that this process of deproxy, where deproxy will send all 3 credential types back to the user will then have to select one of them. All right? So over here, the proxy will send the list to the client. The client will choose the most secured credentials that are available. Okay, so how do, in fact, this is happening? So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So in order for us to see this, the tool that we can use in the proxy is our packet capture. Okay, so we can go ahead and start the packet capture there. So what I'm going to do is let me just launch my browser first. And hoping that it will not slow down my somehow okay, let me just try to double check my connection. Internet options. Where is my internet option? Here you go. Okay, so I'm using explicit here. And I'm going to go to a website, let's say example.org. But let me just clear my browser cache. Oh, what? Okay, let me just clear control. Let me just clear my browser cache. And let me just start to perform a packet capture. And then let's just try to access this website. Okay, so at this point, the proxy should have authenticated this connection. All right, let me just stop this capture now. Okay, so how do we know if the user authenticated that connection? We can actually go to Statistics, Authentication, and we can display by user. Excuse me. So I was authenticated, as what you can see here, right? But this is what I wanted you to show you. Download the capture. Let me just download it, and where is it? Okay. Seems to be slow, yeah? I just say auth.cap. So I'm going to open it with my Wireshark. So let me know if I am getting too fast on my shared screen that you can't see what I'm trying to do, so that I can slow down a bit. It seems that my remote desktop is slow. Okay. Let me just open it again. All right, here you go. Yes, my remote desktop is low. This should not be like this. Okay, and I'm gonna just have to filter my HTTP here. Okay, so with that, let me just try to look for my example.org. So here, this is the example.org. This is the first GET request coming from my example.org. Right, so I have a GET request there. And authentication. So this is my IP address. This is the client IP 10.10.2.101. This is the proxy IP 10.10.2.2. All right, this is explicit. That is why the destination is the proxy. You know that already. Oh, what the heck? It opens twice. Okay, so as you can see, this is the explicit. So the source is the client. The destination is the proxy, explicit, remember. Okay, so now, since authentication is enabled, the proxy will authenticate the user. So at this point, as you can see, since the proxy will authenticate the user, based here, it says that the proxy sends the list to the client. So where is that? Over here. So you can see the proxy is trying to send, this is the proxy 10.10.2.2. The proxy is sending all three credential types. So you have the basic, you have the NTLM, and negotiate for Kerberos. So all three credential types, which is basic, NTLM, and Kerberos, is sent by the proxy, all right, to the user browser. So it says here that the client or the user will choose the most secured credentials that are available. So in fact, it is the client that will select, and it will start with the most secured one. So let's see what, in fact, did the user had selected. So over here, if this is authentication, so here, let's see over this packet. All right, so this is now the client, right? So the client will respond back because it's being authenticated as to authenticate, all right? So you can see this is what the client has selected, okay? This is what the client has selected. Negotiate, proxy authorization, negotiate. And this is, in fact, what is this? All right, this is this one, right? The same. 10.10.2.101, the client respond back to the proxy to authenticate, and this is what the proxy use. Negotiate for. What is negotiate? Based on what we see earlier, Kerberos, right? So this is Kerberos. So basically, over in my testing here, I was in fact using Kerberos. So the client selected Kerberos. Okay? So that is what's going to happen. The user or the user browser, we select Kerberos, and then because as you can see here, all three of them is in fact enabled in proxy. Okay? So because all three of them is enabled by default, the proxy will send three of them. Proxy will send the most secured. If not, then downgrade, and then downgrade. Okay? So that is basically what's going on behind the scene. Now, talking about IWA, Integrated Windows Authentication, okay, there are two different ways for us to configure the proxy to connect to your Active Directory. Okay? So one is what we call direct connection. In IWA Direct, the proxy will communicate to the authentication server directly. Hence the name IWA Direct. Okay? Another method is the use of the agent. So that's IWA with agent, BCAAA. Okay? So Bluecoat Authentication Authorization Agent. Okay? So the difference is, as what you can see here, with BCAAA, there is another server where we install the agent, and the proxy will communicate to the agent. The agent will then communicate to the actual authentication server. So with IWA with BCAAA, the proxy do not access the authentication server directly. While the direct, the proxy access or communicate to the authentication server directly. Okay, so maybe the question is, why you have two, not one? Well, when we introduced authentication feature many years ago, right, the only technology that we have is to use an agent so that we will have the ability to communicate to the Windows API. So the proxy being a device that is foreign to the authentication server, the authentication server will not allow the proxy to communicate to it, right? Because the authentication server do not know the proxy. So hence, we are using a Windows server, a domain member server, to install the agent, and the agent will then communicate to the API to validate user credential. Okay? So when we release, I believe, version 5.3, okay, we now have the technology to let the proxy communicate to the Windows API by configuring the proxy to, in fact, join the Windows domain. All right? So now you have two different methods. So which one are you going to use? Well, it really depends on the environment, right? So some environment may not allow proxy to join domain, right? Because it is not a Windows server or it is not a Windows machine. Okay? Some environment, it is okay to join, so fine, let's join. We support multiple domain, version 5.4 in above. IWA with Becca, if you wanted to use this, fine also, but you have to make sure that you have spare servers to install the agent. Okay, so newer deployment, they prefer to use direct because it eliminates the use of additional resources for them. Okay, that is also fine. So it's your choice. So how is the configuration looks like then for IWA Direct? So basically for IWA Direct, the proxy joins the Windows domain. So because you will let the proxy join the Windows domain, then obviously you need a credential for the proxy to join the domain. Okay? There are a few things that needs to be checked before the proxy can join the domain. One is the proxy must be synchronized to your AD server in terms of the clock. It should not be off by 15 minutes. So clock is important, all right? And if you're using a network time protocol server, you can point your proxy towards it so that it has a synchronized clock with your AD. And also, the proxy DNS must resolve your AD server. All right? So, meaning to say, if you are using a public DNS server to your proxy, so let's say you're using 4.2.2 or any public DNS, then it will not work on IWA Direct scenario. So now you have to make sure you use a private DNS server so that, because the list of AD server will be gotten by the proxy or be taken by the proxy from the DNS server. Okay, so those two is important. We do support multi-tenant, so not 5.4 but 6.4. So not 5.3 but 6.3 when we release this IWA Direct feature. Okay, so that is basically it. For the agent, so the agent has to be downloaded. So where do we download the agent? So of course from support.symantec.com. So you have your My Symantec. You can go ahead and download it based on your operating system version that you are using in your proxy. Okay? So the proxy do not have backward compatibility with the agent. The agent have. So if you are going to install the agent, make sure the agent is a newer version. Okay? The agent runs on its own computer. It is a domain member computer. It is not running on proxy. All right, so with that, we can communicate to the Windows API. We can have multiple agents installed in the network. In case in a large deployment, you can put a load balancer and load balance connection from proxy to the agent. Security and performance-wise, use SSL between the proxy and the agent to secure communication, especially if you're using basic authentication. Okay, and if you can limit access from a certain IP address to the Becca server, it will be good so that only proxy have IP address can connect to it. Performance-wise, this is related to the user agent. Likewise, performance-wise, we want you to dedicate a server for the agent because the server do not belong to Symantec. Some end user will use the server for other purpose, and that degrades the performance also of the agent. And it will ripple back to your proxy because if authentication, validation is not returned to the proxy in a timely manner, that will slow down the proxy. Hence, it will slow down also the user experience. Okay? Now, group of interest. So basically, how do as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why we wanted to use authentication is that we can now start to create policy based on group. So group memberships is acquired by the user the moment they are going to log into the network. So it really depends on your credential type, right? So it really depends on your credential type. Or it depends on the authentication server that you are using, really, for your group. So if you are using NTLM, so with NTLM, there is what we call a security identifier that will include your group membership. So the moment you log into your domain, right, your group membership will be carried by your SID for NTLM. Okay, now for Kerberos, it's slightly different because Kerberos is using encrypted ticket. So with Kerberos, basically, when you log into your domain, right, your user or your machine will in fact connect to your ticket granting server, and it will ask for a ticket. Your group membership will contain on that ticket as well. All right, but that is taken care of by the proxy and the user and the domain controller. So that is how group membership is synchronized to the proxy. So especially when you start to create policy. Okay. Now, it is not uncommon to see that in a large enterprise environment, there are multiple authentication servers. Okay? There are multiple authentication servers. It's common because you want to have some form of redundancy, right? So, with that, the proxy will have to connect to any one of your domain controller in your network. Okay? So how do, in fact, the proxy find out what domain controller to connect to if you have multiple domain controller? And likewise, maybe you have a load balancer in front of it, right? How do the proxy know which domain controller to connect to? So basically, the proxy will perform, after the proxy obtain the list of your domain or DC within your DNS server, via your DNS server, what the proxy will do is it will perform an LDAP ping to all the domain controllers, right? That is what the proxy will do. So what happens is the proxy will ping using LDAP ping, so ping on 389 port of LDAP, and the fastest or the fastest to respond to the proxy in terms of that LDAP ping, that is what the proxy will then select to send authentication validation. Okay? The proxy will establish an SMB connection to that domain controller. Okay? But the LDAP ping method of connection to your domain controller is not always very effective. Okay. So lost audio. Okay, how about the rest? Are you guys able to hear me? Let me can you guys still hear me? Okay, so let us wait for a while for Brad to join us back. Okay. Testing. All good? Okay, so it seems like Brad can hear. Perfect. All right then. Let me let me just repeat what I have just said on this slide that I'm showing you right now. All right. So now I'm sharing it. I'm sharing my slide again. Okay. So let me again repeat this. So as I mentioned, that what happened is the proxy, once it joins the domain, the proxy will take the list of all configured DNS, configured domain controller via your domain controller, via your DNS. So that is where the proxy would find out what is the domain controller via the DNS. So after the proxy finds the list, the proxy will then perform an LDAP ping to the domain controller. So ping on port 389 for the domain controller. The first domain controller that will respond to the ping, the fastest, the proxy will then establish an SMB connection to that domain controller and use that domain controller to verify or validate user credential. All right? That is basically what the proxy will do. Now, to show you this, let's take a look at this. So this example of mine here, my demo lab, I am connected to my domain controller already because I was able to authenticate. Now, I can, in fact, able to find out what is the domain controller that I am connected to, right? But in our lab environment, we only have single domain controller. So you don't see the long list. All right? So LSA stats is an advanced URL that you can see what is the domain controller in the list that the proxy is able to find out when it tries to locate them via DNS. Okay? So it shows the list of all domain controller. In the lab, we have only one domain controller, so that's why you see only one here. So what happens is after the proxy performs LDAP ping, the proxy will list all the DCs and list also what is the response for that ping. Then the proxy will use the fastest to respond to that ping. So in this case, the server that responds the fastest is 10.10.2.5, which is the only server I have in the lab. Okay? So that is, you can make use of this advanced URL, LSA stats. Now, problem with that is that method is what if the domain controller that you want the proxy to connect to is offline during the time? Or what if that is not the domain controller you would like your proxy to use? Okay? So maybe, you have multiple locations. So let's say you have a proxy in, let's say your proxy is in Australia, and then your domain controller is in India, right? And then you have also a domain controller in Turkey, okay? So because the proxy is in Australia, and you notice that when you run an LSA stat, you notice that it connects to the domain controller in, let's say, in Turkey. So geographically, the location between the proxy and the domain controller is, it's not there. So you would want the Australian proxy to connect to Australia domain controller, right? Well, maybe, but basically that is what you would want to do, because the closer it is, the latency is much more shorter, right? The latency is much better. So even though the LDAP ping might respond back with a high speed in terms of milliseconds. So, that could be a problem for you if you do not want other domain controller to be connected to. So, in fact, in proxy, we can actually select or hard code the domain controller that you want to use, especially for NTLM use, okay? So, from proxy, right, we have this ability to do this. Okay, so if you go back to our proxy here, okay, so after you join the domain, so let's say this is my proxy here, which is join the domain. I'll edit this proxy. So after I edit, you notice that I have an ability to actually define primary or preferred domain controller and alternate domain controller. All right, I can do that. So if I am going to remove this, remember this is for NTLM only, okay? So if I am going to remove this, all right, so what will the proxy do? It will perform an LDAP ping, and it will select the fastest if I remove it, okay? Now, if I put my preferred domain controller and alternate, if both of them goes down, what will happen? If both of them is down, my preferred in my alternate, the proxy will then fall back to LDAP ping. Okay? So if both of them unluckily goes down, so the proxy will fall back to LDAP ping and find out who will be the domain controller that will respond the fastest. And it will also select that. So you still don't lose the authentication or validation of the user, even though your preferred in alternate goes down. All right? We also support what we call RODC, or read-only domain controller. So basically, RODCs are domain controller that holds the read-only copy of your AD partition. Okay, so this type of RODCs are typically deployed in some untrusted environment. All right, we do support this in proxy, but IWA Direct in version 6.5.2 will only connect to RODC if it is specified as preferred or alternate. Okay? All right. Okay, so this will be your first lab exercise. So here we go. So bring up your lab guide. Now, so this is the lab that you will be